A ceasefire with no end date is not a ceasefire. It's a countdown nobody can read. As of April 22, 2026, the United States and Iran are technically still at peace, and functionally still at war. President Donald Trump extended a 2-week truce just hours before it was set to expire today, with no new deadline, no confirmed talks, and a U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports still fully in force. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi called that blockade an act of war this morning. An advisor to Iran's parliament speaker called Trump's extension a ploy to buy time for a surprise strike. And a senior U.S. administration official told CNN that Trump's own public statements have been, in that official's words, detrimental to the talks. Both sides wanted a ceasefire. Both sides built a trap inside it. And now neither side knows how to get out. This is how the gamble happened, and what it has already cost the world. To understand the trap, you have to understand what each side actually needed from this ceasefire, and why those needs were structurally incompatible from the first day. The war began on February 28, 2026. The United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iranian military infrastructure, ballistic missile factories, and senior commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. Iran retaliated with its most consequential strategic move. It closed the Strait of Hormuz. At 34 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, 21 miles between Iran and Oman, the strait carries approximately 20 million barrels of oil per day in peacetime. That is 20% of all seaborne crude oil traded globally. Iran had threatened to close it for decades. On March 4, 2026, an IRGC official made it official. The strait was closed. The global economy began paying the price within 72 hours. Brent crude surged past $120 per barrel. U.S. gas prices hit $4 per gallon by March 31st, a 30% spike in weeks. The Philippines declared a national energy emergency on March 24th. European gas storage, entering the crisis at just 30% capacity after a brutal winter, began an accelerated depletion cycle that analysts warned could become a repeat of the 2022 Ukraine energy crisis. The economic damage to Arab Gulf states alone exceeded $120 billion by March 31st. Iran's own government estimated the war had cost its economy between $300 billion and $1 trillion by April 11th. The 2026 Iran war had already produced, according to researchers at the Dallas Federal Reserve, the largest geopolitical oil supply disruption in recorded history, between 2 and 3 times the magnitude of the 1973 Arab oil embargo. Both sides had powerful reasons to stop, and both sides had equally powerful reasons to keep fighting. For Trump, the ceasefire was a path to a deal that would be visibly superior to the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, which he had withdrawn from in 2018 and spent 7 years calling the worst deal ever made. A new agreement, one that permanently ended Iranian nuclear enrichment and kept the strait open, would be the signature foreign policy legacy of his second term. For Tehran, the ceasefire was a chance to stop the bleeding, military, economic, and physical, while protecting the one asset Iran had left that Washington could not simply bomb away: its sovereign right to enrich uranium. Those two objectives were not compatible, and the ceasefire they agreed to on April 8th did not resolve that incompatibility. It merely paused the fighting long enough for both sides to discover, in public, how far apart they truly were. That discovery became a trap. Here is precisely how the trap was constructed, move by move, decision by decision, from the moment the ceasefire was announced. On April 7th, the day before the ceasefire was formally confirmed, Trump posted on Truth Social that a whole civilization would die tonight if Iran did not reach an agreement. That was a negotiating threat issued at the exact moment Pakistan was trying to close the deal. Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi confirmed the ceasefire the next day regardless. Trump announced it with a specific condition: Iran would immediately open the Strait of Hormuz and the parties would negotiate a permanent peace framework within 15 to 20 days. J.D. Vance, at the same press conference, described it as a fragile truce. The gap between those two characterizations, done deal versus fragile truce, was not a communications error. It was a preview. Within 24 hours, the ceasefire's central premise had collapsed. Iran began conditioning Hormuz traffic rather than opening it freely, and then suspended passage entirely when Israel launched what Lebanese authorities described as the strongest wave of attacks on Lebanon since the start of the war. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif had publicly stated the ceasefire covered all fronts, including Lebanon. Trump and Vance both said Lebanon was not included. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu confirmed it. Hezbollah said it had paused its attacks on Israel. Israel struck anyway. Iran said the agreement was void. The Lebanese government called it a war crime. Over 2,454 people had already been killed in Lebanon by Israeli strikes. Tehran's position was that it could not open Hormuz while its allied forces were being bombed in a country the ceasefire was supposed to protect. Washington's position was that Lebanon was never part of the deal. Both positions were stated publicly. Neither side blinked. By April 9th, less than 48 hours into the two-week truce, 230 loaded oil tankers were waiting inside the Gulf, according to the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company CEO Sultan Al Jaber. The strait was not open, the ceasefire was not holding, and the Islamabad talks, the entire purpose of the pause, had not yet been scheduled. On April 11th, Vice President Vance flew to Islamabad alongside Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff and senior advisor Jared Kushner. It was the highest-level direct engagement between U.S. and Iranian officials since the 1979 Iranian Revolution. 47 years of bilateral hostility compressed into a single Serena Hotel conference room in Pakistan's quiet capital. The Iranian delegation, led by Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf and Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, arrived on a plane that carried photographs of schoolchildren killed in a U.S. missile strike, placed on empty seats in the aircraft cabin. The optics were deliberate. The talks lasted 21 hours. They produced no agreement. The central sticking point was uranium enrichment. Washington proposed a 20-year moratorium on Iranian enrichment. Tehran countered within 5 years. It was not a technical gap. It was a fundamental disagreement about whether Iran has a sovereign right to enrich uranium at all. Vance told reporters as he left, "We have not reached an agreement, and I think that's bad news for Iran much more than it's bad news for the U.S." Araghchi said the two sides had come within inches of an understanding, but encountered, in his words, maximalism, shifting goalposts, and blockade. After the talks failed, Trump announced a full U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports, effective April 13th. The IRGC stated that any military vessel approaching the strait would be considered a ceasefire violation and would meet a severe response. The trap had fully closed on both sides. What happened next was a masterclass in how not to conduct secret diplomacy. On Friday, April 18th, the war appeared to be ending. Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi declared the Strait of Hormuz completely open. Global markets surged. Oil prices dropped more than 10% in hours. Trump was on the phone with reporters all morning. He told Bloomberg that Iran had agreed to an unlimited suspension of its nuclear program. He told CBS News that Tehran had agreed to everything. He told Axios that a meeting would probably take place over the weekend and that a deal would be reached in a day or two. His White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, said the United States had never been closer to a good deal with Iran. None of it was true. Sources directly familiar with the talks told CNN that Iran had not agreed to any of those provisions. The Iranians had not signed off on surrendering their enriched uranium. They had not agreed to an unlimited suspension. They had not agreed to everything. They were still negotiating, carefully, cautiously through Pakistani intermediaries, and every false declaration from Washington was making that negotiation harder. One person familiar with the discussions told CNN directly, "The Iranians didn't appreciate the president negotiating through social media and making it appear as if they had signed off on issues they hadn't yet agreed to, and ones that aren't popular with their people back home." Iranian Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf went further, accusing Trump publicly of trying to turn the negotiating table into a table of surrender, or to justify renewed warmongering. Within 24 hours of Araghchi's announcement that the strait was open, the IRGC fired on tankers attempting to cross it. The ceasefire's fragile momentum shattered. U.S. officials, in background briefings, told CNN they believed the IRGC attacks reflected an internal divide inside the Iranian government, specifically between the diplomatic team of Ghalibaf and Araghchi, who had been moving toward a framework, and IRGC Commander General Ahmad Vahidi, whose forces answer to a different chain of authority. One senior official described the moment. "We thought they were negotiating with the right people. They had reached the cocktail of what they had agreed to, what could be announced." Then the IRGC fired. On the weekend of April 19th and 20, a U.S. guided missile destroyer fired on and seized an Iranian cargo ship attempting to pass the blockade in the Gulf of Oman. Iran's Joint Military Command called it an act of piracy. Iran's UN ambassador Amir Saeed Iravani wrote to UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, calling it a clear and material breach of the ceasefire and an act of aggression. The U.S. Treasury simultaneously sanctioned 14 additional Iranian-linked individuals and entities. Both sides were in the middle of a ceasefire and simultaneously escalating. The trap had not just closed, it was locked. Here is what the coverage is missing: the layer beneath the layer, the mechanisms driving this conflict that neither Washington nor Tehran is discussing publicly. There is a precise historical precedent for what the United States is attempting. In March 1946, the Soviet Union refused to withdraw its troops from northern Iran after the end of World War II, occupying the Azerbaijan and Kurdistan regions and supporting separatist movements there. President Harry Truman applied relentless diplomatic pressure, backed by an implicit military threat, and by May 1946, Soviet forces had withdrawn. The lesson drawn from that episode, and it was drawn explicitly by multiple administrations, was that Iran responds to sustained pressure combined with a credible off-ramp. The keyword is credible. Truman gave Stalin a face-saving path out, a joint Soviet-Iranian oil company that was never ultimately ratified, but which allowed Moscow to withdraw without appearing to have simply capitulated. Trump's current framework offers Tehran no equivalent face-saving mechanism. The demand for complete, permanent, verifiable denuclearization with no Iranian enrichment, ever, asks Iran to surrender the one strategic asset that its entire security doctrine has been built around for 20 years. There is no off-ramp. There is only surrender or escalation. The silent beneficiary of this stalemate is not Russia or China, though both are gaining. It is the global arms industry. According to data from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, global defense spending had already reached a record $244 trillion in 2024. The 2026 Iran war has triggered emergency procurement across NATO, across Gulf states, and across Asia. Taiwan accelerated its defense budget. South Korea increased missile stockpile orders. Germany triggered its emergency defense fund for the third consecutive year. Every day the war continues, in active fighting or in ceasefire limbo, is a day that defense contractors in the United States, France, the United Kingdom, and Israel are fulfilling orders that were placed because of the war's existence. The economic incentive to resolve this conflict quickly is felt most acutely by oil consumers. The economic incentive to let it drag is felt most acutely by the sector that builds the weapons used to fight it. The unnamed risk, the one that no analyst is yet quantifying in public, is what happens to Iran's buried nuclear material during an extended ceasefire. Trump has used the term nuclear dust repeatedly to describe Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium, material left at the sites struck by Operation Midnight Hammer in June 2025, buried under collapsed mountain infrastructure. He wrote on Truth Social on April 21st that digging it out will be a long and difficult process. But the material is there. It is under Iranian soil, and an extended ceasefire, with no deadline, no inspectors, no International Atomic Energy Agency access. The IAEA has had no verified access to Iranian nuclear sites since the June 2025 strikes, gives Iran time to do exactly what Washington most fears: excavate, recover, and relocate whatever enriched uranium survived Operation Midnight Hammer. The longer the ceasefire with no deal, the more time Tehran has to reconstitute what 14 bunker-busting bombs were deployed to destroy. The global economy is not waiting for a deal, it is paying the price of there not being one. The Strait of Hormuz carries 27% of the world's maritime crude oil trade in peacetime. It has been functionally closed, or operating at dangerously reduced capacity, since March 4, 2026. By mid-April, supply disruptions had cumulatively surpassed 500 million barrels of crude, condensates, and natural gas liquids, according to market analyst Rory Johnston of Commodity Context. Johnston warned that even an immediate deal announcement would not undo that damage. It would take months to claw back the lost supply, keeping oil prices elevated far beyond any agreement date. The Iran war fuel crisis has now spread across 4 continents. Qatar Energy declared force majeure on all LNG exports after its Ras Laffan facility, the world's largest LNG plant, sustained missile damage that the company warned will take up to 5 years to repair. That facility alone supplies a significant portion of Europe's natural gas imports. Dutch TTF gas benchmarks, Europe's pricing reference, nearly doubled to over 60 euros per megawatt hour by mid-March. The European Central Bank postponed planned rate cuts on March 19th. The OECD forecast U.S. inflation at 4.2% for 2026, 1.2 percentage points above pre-war projections. Germany's annual growth forecast was cut to 0.6%. Over 220,000 Indian nationals were repatriated from the Gulf and Iran by March 2026, as infrastructure strikes made the region unsafe for migrant workers. The term returnees entered the South Asian economic lexicon as a crisis category. Pakistan, the country mediating between Washington and Tehran, is itself one of the worst-hit economies in the conflict. Universities closed to conserve fuel, energy emergency declared in multiple provinces, and a mediating role it can barely afford to play stretched across a country of 240 million people that imports the majority of its energy through supply chains the war has disrupted. The mediator is bleeding from the same wound it is trying to close. Energy Secretary Chris Wright indicated in mid-April that the Coordinated International Energy Agency release of strategic oil reserves could reach 3 million barrels per day to offset some of the supply shock. But that is a temporary instrument. Reserve drawdowns cannot substitute for a reopened strait. The Philippines, the first nation to declare a national energy emergency on March 24th, imports 98% of its oil from the Middle East. Its government stated it had supply until June 30th. The clock is running. A deal that comes in July saves nobody in Manila. 3 paths remain open. Each one reveals something about the nature of the trap that was built. The first path, Iran submits a unified proposal, one that the IRGC and the diplomatic team both endorse, and a second round of talks in Islamabad produces a framework agreement. Under this path, the strait reopens, the blockade lifts, and a new deal enters implementation. This path requires something Trump's own advisors have told CNN is the central uncertainty, that Ghalibaf, Aragchi, and IRGC Commander General Ahmad Vahidi are actually speaking with one voice. Every public signal since April 12th suggests they are not. Former lead U.S. negotiator Wendy Sherman, who spent 18 months negotiating the 2015 JCPOA, told NPR last week that Trump's approach is all wrong. Her assessment, you cannot do a negotiation with Iran in one day. You can't even do it in a week. Rob Malley, who served as Iran's special envoy under President Biden, summarized the structural mismatch in a single sentence. Trump is impulsive and temperamental. Iran's leadership is stubborn and tenacious. The second path, the ceasefire continues indefinitely without a deal. The blockade stays. Hormuz stays functionally closed or intermittently contested. Oil prices remain above $120 per barrel through the summer refill season. The European energy crisis deepens. The November 2026 U.S. midterm elections become a referendum on gas prices. Iran, according to one analyst's estimate cited in the Wikipedia record of the 2026 Iran war, has approximately 13 days of oil storage capacity before its own fields face shutdown. Fields that, once damaged, may take years to restore. Each side is betting the other's economy breaks first. This is mutually assured economic pain. Bloomberg Economics modeled that at $170 per barrel. The stagflationary shock to the euro area alone would double in severity, cutting GDP by more than 1.6 percentage points and adding over 4 points to annual inflation. That scenario is not a stress test anymore. It is a risk case with a visible probability. The third path, the ceasefire collapses entirely. A second ship seizure, a U.S. strike on Iranian fast attack boats, an IRGC missile aimed at a U.S. destroyer. Any of these could provide the trigger. Trump has been unequivocal about what follows. He told Fox News on April 20th that if Iran doesn't sign a deal, the whole country is getting blown up. He threatened Truth Social to knock out every single power plant and every single bridge in Iran. International legal experts have described targeting civilian infrastructure as a potential violation of the laws of armed conflict. Whether that deterrent threat is credible is precisely the question the IRGC is asking right now. If the answer is no, if Tehran's military leadership concludes that Trump will not restart the bombing, then the blockade becomes Iran's leverage, not its vulnerability. And a ceasefire with no end date, no inspectors, and no enforcement mechanism becomes not a pause in the war, but the cover under which Iran reconstitutes. The title of this documentary is not a metaphor. A trap requires two things: bait and a mechanism that closes. The bait on both sides was the same: the promise of peace. For Trump, the promise was a deal greater than anything Obama achieved, a legacy-defining agreement that would end Iranian nuclear ambition and reopen the world's most important energy corridor. For Tehran, the promise was relief from bombs, from sanctions, from an economic siege that had cost the country up to $1 trillion in 8 weeks of war. Both sides took the bait, and the mechanism that closed the trap on each of them was not the enemy. It was themselves. Trump's Truth Social posts destroyed the negotiating space his own team had carefully built. His public declarations that Iran had agreed to everything, made while his negotiators were still in the room offering $20 billion in frozen assets for a temporary enrichment moratorium, told Tehran that Washington couldn't be trusted to keep a quiet channel quiet. Iran's IRGC, meanwhile, fired on tankers the very day its own foreign minister declared the strait open, demonstrating live to every observer in Washington that the Iranian delegation at the table did not control the Iranian forces in the water. Neither leader could deliver what they promised. Neither institution could discipline itself enough to let diplomacy work. And the world, its oil supply, its food chains, its airline routes, its inflation rates, its growth forecasts, is absorbing the cost of that mutual failure in real time. The trap is still open, technically. So, what do you think? When a deal keeps failing because both sides keep sabotaging their own negotiators, is there any ceasefire that can actually hold, or has the gamble already been lost? Share your thoughts in the comments below. TGN presented. Thank you for choosing us.